Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a Watchman Newscast live stream. We are essentially going every day here during this war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, a war which may soon spread to other fronts, as we have discussed here on the newscast in recent days. I want to start today with, if you thought there may be a lull in the fighting and that Hamas, some had said, well, it looks like Hamas has maybe changed its spots. Some geniuses in the mainstream media were implying yesterday and around the world. If you thought that was the case, well, newsflash here as we begin today, Hamas fired hundreds upon hundreds of rockets at central Israel today, in particular at Tel Aviv, and at least 5 Israelis were wounded, intentionally targeting civilians. No stated goal or no aim by Hamas to strike at Israeli military targets, although that would not have disappointed Hamas, obviously, either. But with these rocket barrages, Hamas has one goal in mind: to slaughter innocent civilians. Now, the world seems to be in an uproar over civilians in Gaza, but it seems that the memory of October 7th is fading for some in the so-called international community. You remember October 7th, right? When 1,400 Israelis were massacred in cold blood, the vast majority of them civilians, massacred in all sorts of gruesome ways that we're hearing more and more about now, as video of Israel's interrogations of Hamas terrorists who were involved in an October 7th attack. Those videos, we have these Hamas terrorists on record sharing exactly what they did and what they were told to do by their Hamas masters. Now, speaking of their Hamas masters, let's start with a question here. And welcome to everyone from around the world that's watching. I see someone from Munich, Germany right now. I see Scotland. I see North Carolina, Kentucky. We'll have people from everywhere, all over the world before we are done. Thousands with us, thousands more coming. Northern Ireland, welcome everyone. Great to have you. Australia, great to have you all here with us for such a time as this. But I want to begin with a question for everyone. Qatar. People pronounce it different ways. I know I said Qatar last week. That's usually how it's pronounced in the Middle East, in the circles I travel in. But people on the comments last week said, no, it's Qatar. Okay, Qatar, whatever you want to call it. Here's a question for you. Should their leadership in Qatar face consequences for harboring and supporting Hamas? Hamas's senior leadership, including Ismail Haniyeh, including former leader Khaled Mashal, reside in Qatar right now. Well, Qatar is an ally of the United States and, look, is a recipient of U.S. aid and military cooperation. U.S. troops have been stationed there. So clearly the U.S. has leverage in that relationship. Should there be consequences? Should there be a demand to Qatar to hand over the likes of Ismail Haniyeh, these Hamas leaders who were calling the shots from that country while Gaza is in flames and while Israelis are being slaughtered and while their fellow Gazans are being killed? Thanks to Hamas, by the way. Key point, folks, any civilian casualties right now in Gaza are the sole responsibility of Hamas. Israel now has spent the better part of the past 2 weeks calling for Gazan civilians to evacuate from the northern half of Gaza to the southern half. Hamas has blocked them physically and attempted to prevent them from fleeing, number one. Number two, Hamas willfully uses civilians as human shields. And then inevitably, when some of these civilians are killed, it is a war, and they're being used as human shields, after all, intentionally being put in the line of fire. So when some tragically and, naturally are killed as they're being used as human shields, that's a natural outcome of such a dastardly act by Hamas. Hamas then beams those images throughout the world for propaganda value. So all of that's unfolding in Gaza, while Hamas's senior leadership, or much of it, is in Qatar. Some was in Turkey, but the bulk now seems to be in Qatar. So shouldn't the U.S. and the free nations of the world band together and put pressure on that nation and demand that they extradite the likes of Ismail Haniyeh to stand trial for war crimes, a modern-day Nuremberg trial? Look, Hamas are modern-day Nazis, just wearing different uniforms. This is very clear. If you doubt that, just listen again to the testimonies of these Hamas prisoners who are sharing it all with their Israeli interrogators, what the goals were on October 7th and what exactly they did. Gruesome, demonic, wicked acts, heinous. And the leadership in Qatar's fingerprints are all over it. So if we have leverage with this nation and they're essentially harboring these demonic individuals, should they not be extradited? Should there not be pressure applied there? What do you think? Because I feel like in this whole conversation, Qatar is kind of getting a pass in large part. Many don't know a whole lot about this country, small Gulf nation. I get it. But a pivotal player here, which has provided material support to Hamas for years. So there has to be, we're talking about consequences, right? We've been talking about consequences for the Iranian regime and their role in instigating all of this. What about Qatar? So I want to know your thoughts on that. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. That's one place to start. And as we talk about short memories when it comes to October 7th and how the world is so quick to forget. And look, 2 weeks ago here on the newscast, we said, look, folks, get ready. In a few days, the world is going to return to its default position of knee-jerk anti-Israel bile and basically saying to Israel, you know, Israel, it's a shame what happened, but number one, you had it coming for all that you've done, supposedly, to the Palestinians over the years. And number two, you must have a proportionate response. You cannot act with severity against Gaza, against the Hamas jihadists living there. Civilians might get killed. So there needs to be an immediate ceasefire and a proportionate response. And an international peacekeeping force, perhaps. That would be the grand plan of the likes of the UN. But if you have any doubt about what I'm saying, number one, Barack Obama, remember him, former U.S. president, released a statement yesterday, highly critical of Israel, warning Israel to follow the international rules of war and things that Israel knows very well and does anyway. Doesn't need Barack Obama lecturing and intoning to them. Nonetheless, he couldn't resist wading in and taking some pot shots at Israel. Well, Israel has the right to defend itself, but that was the tenor of the statement. That's been the tenor of many in the West and Western so-called leaders over the past 2 weeks plus. And here today we have at the UN an absolute moral disgrace. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, makes a statement, and I just want to quote from him directly. Let me pull it up real quick. Saying, and I quote, October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. Wait, I thought it was 75 years in their view. Oh, he means 56. Okay. So he means since 1967, Israel's miraculous victory in the Six-Day War, where they reunited Jerusalem and once again exercise control over Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland. Okay, I guess that's what he means by 56 years. But October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. Folks, read between the lines. This is the Secretary General of the UN basically saying, hey, you know what? Israel had it coming. They provoked this. It's Israel's fault. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened not because Hamas is a vicious, genocidal, jihadist organization devoted to Israel's destruction. It happened because the Palestinian people had been supposedly subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. Wait, I forgot. There is not one Israeli living in Gaza right now. Oh, there are Israeli hostages there, over 200. Yeah, they're still there in the bowels of hell in some tunnels beneath Gaza right now in Hamas captivity. But other than that, we have very short memories at the UN, apparently, because in 2005, every last Israeli disengaged, as they called it, withdrew from Gaza. Beautiful Israeli communities in Gaza were uprooted, and every last Israeli left. So there is no occupation of Gaza. Free Palestine, yes, from Hamas. And by the way, there is no entity, there is no nation state known as Palestine. There's Gaza, And there's the West Bank, which we call here in the newscast Judea and Samaria, because that's what the Bible calls it. And if it's good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for us. Needless to say, it is the biblical heartland. What occupation when we're talking about Gaza? And by the way, I don't consider the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria an occupation. That's Israelis living in the land of their forefathers, where their forefathers and mothers lived 3,000 years ago. Call me crazy. I think Jews should be able to live wherever they want to live. Seems pretty natural to me. You live where you want to live. But that's not the view of our enlightened overlords here in the West and at the UN, who certainly believe that Palestinians and Muslims should be able to live wherever they want. Just look at protests in the United States and in Europe over the past few weeks, heavily led by native Western leftists, united in an alliance with many from Middle Eastern origin who emigrated to the West. So interesting and maddening, the double standards that continued. But that was at the UN today. That's the UN Secretary General. And thankfully, Israel's ambassador to the UN had a very strong response. Gilad Erdan, our friend, we've interviewed him here on the Watchman. You've seen him here before. He called on Gutierrez to resign. And rightly so. Also, Israel's foreign minister, Eli Cohen, also spoke today before the UN before the UN Security Council. This all happened today at a meeting of the Security Council, by the way. Gutierrez's comments, then Erdan called on him to resign, rightly. And Eli Cohen also spoke there, Israel's foreign minister, and said, I think he said something to the effect of, what world do you live in, to Gutierrez, or what planet are you on, basically? This is insane. 1,400 of our people were just slaughtered in cold blood in the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It was our 9/11, our Pearl Harbor, and you're bashing us. That was essentially the message that was transmitted at the UN today by Israeli officials, and rightly so. By the way, Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, was also there. And look, he said, key word there, said all the right things. Said to the UN, where is your outrage? Where is the horror over these Israelis who were slaughtered? Israel has a right to defend itself. Any nation here in the Security Council would do the same thing, would defend itself. So publicly, hey, making very nice pro-Israel statements, no doubt. But what is going on behind the scenes right now with the Biden administration and Western leaders? I'm going to break that down a bit and let you know what I think is really going on. And folks, it ain't good. Have you ever heard the term talking out both sides of your mouth? So I think we have a lot of that going on. A concerted effort, by the way, among Western leaders where Israel is being restrained. And it's a troubling signal. So I'm going to break that down in a minute. Before I do, again, welcome everyone who's watching. We're here every day for you live. And if you have not subscribed and you like what you're hearing, please subscribe and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. We would love to have you here every day with us as watchmen and women on the wall in these Bible times that we are living in right now. Okay, what else do we have here? I want to break down what I believe is going on here. And I talked about earlier an international peacekeeping force. You might say, that sounds crazy. Well, not to, again, the folks at the EU, the European Union, and the UN. Today, Emmanuel Macron of France was visiting Israel. He was the latest in a line of Western leaders to visit Israel in the past week plus and meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, on one hand, again, the public statements and the public shows of support are a good thing, folks. Make no mistake about it, especially in the Middle East, where perception oftentimes is everything. For the likes of Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, they're watching. Believe me, they're watching the West reaction and the reaction of Israel's so-called allies in the West. So look, to have Western leaders coming to Israel and expressing public shows of solidarity on its face is a good thing. The problem I have is what's being said behind the scenes. And today, Emmanuel Macron, just a little side note here, called for an international coalition to take on Hamas. Interesting. I think Israel, as a sovereign nation, not only can, but absolutely 110% wants to handle its own security. Israel has made very clear it doesn't want any American or European boots on the ground in this fight. Logistical support, of course. Support with weapon systems, of course. No doubt. Israel's been very clear about that. But Israelis want to do the fighting. Israelis want to defend Israel. Israel's a sovereign nation that shouldn't be lectured to time and time again, but that's what's happening. But more on that in a minute. What I want to say is what I think is going on every day, every other day, we're seeing a new Western leader come. Folks, that it does. It holds up the ground invasion, that planned ground incursion by Israel. Now, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. We don't have all the answers about why that ground invasion has been delayed. There may be very good reasons, tactical and strategic reasons. So I'm not going to question the IDF on that. But is Israel's political leadership behind the scenes being pressured incessantly to have again, proportionate, quote unquote, measured response? And Gaza civilians, humanitarian corridor, Israel being bludgeoned over the head with that behind the scenes by Western leaders, in particular the Biden administration. That's my concern, that Israeli leaders are starting to feel like they have their hands tied a bit. Hey, they're saying all the right things. They're going to go in, they're going to take care of business and crush Hamas once and for all, and that needs to be done. And if Israel does not do that, the message that sends to Iran and Hezbollah, if Hamas lives to fight another day, talk about sending a horrible message of weakness to your enemies. So Israel, I believe, is going to do the job and crush this demonic terrorist organization decisively. But my concern is that Israel is going to do so with the constant hectoring, quote unquote, of the quote unquote international community, in particular the Biden administration. Again, great words in public, but behind the scenes, are you constantly pressuring Israel to hold back? And that's my concern, that's some of the wrangling going on behind the scenes right now. And the more these leaders come to Israel, the more, look, you're not going to launch a ground invasion when the president of France is in your country, or the president of the United States, or the chancellor of Germany. So it's kind of delaying things for Israel more. Again, the political considerations. Look, leaders of the Israel Defense Forces are saying, we're ready. And I've texted with buddies who are in the Israeli reserves. They're on the front lines. They're training every day hard. They're ready. And they want Hamas to pay a price for what it did. So the unity, the morale of the people of Israel is sky high, no doubt. But folks, let's keep an eye on this pressure. And many times this administration in D.C., I think, takes cues from Barack Obama in many ways. They hold him in very high regard. Many of them worked under his administration. And I quoted partially from his statement yesterday, which was critical of Israel. It condemned Hamas. Yes, it did. But it also criticized Israel. There's not so much in this. I don't want to go that far and say he drew a moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas, but was unduly critical of Israel. It wasn't necessary and it wasn't accurate. Now, today at the UN, the Secretary General, as I laid out for you, drew that moral equivalency blatantly and disgracefully. But keep an eye on this, folks. The battle of the court of world opinion, the battle for world opinion. Israel, sadly, is really the only nation in the world when it moves to protect its people, protect its citizens. This nation, just think about it, folks. This sovereign nation, a sovereign nation. It's not a vassal state. It's a sovereign nation. The size of the state of New Jersey, which is surrounded by enemies on all sides. It's attacked again and again and again. It was attacked again in a massive, horrific massacre on October 7th. It did what any nation would do, and it went to defend itself, and right away the world is piling on. Think about Israel's prophetic role, folks. And if you doubt it, I had a friend last week who asked me, why is the whole world obsessed with Israel? This tiny, it's the size of the state of New Jersey. It was only reborn 75 years ago in 1948. Yet the entire world is obsessed with this tiny sliver of land. Why? Why Israel? If Israel makes one move, the world pounces. Don't you do that. Don't you dare. Israel, proportionate response. God, it's unbelievable, the relentless assault. The world is obsessed with Israel. Does anyone disagree? Do you doubt it? Israel was attacked. And yet the world obsessively, after a few days, maybe a short grace period, starts to bombard Israel, put the pressure on Israel. Israel, we're watching your every move. If there's one civilian casualty, Israel, your leaders will be dragged before an international tribunal and charged with war crimes. We're watching you. You are held to a different standard, Israel. As the Biden administration says, we're asking Israel tough questions again and again. To the point where there is a U.S. three-star general in Israel right now, observing and advising. And look, on one hand, the U.S. or Israel will take some wise advice. The U.S. has been in these fights, urban fighting in Iraq, the kind of urban and guerrilla warfare that Israel is going to face most likely in Gaza. Think of Fallujah in 2004, etc. The U.S. has seen this before. But we have Anthony Blinken last week, and I believe Joe Biden separately, sitting in on war cabinet meetings of the Israeli government. Very interesting. And spokesman John Kirby, White House spokesman, continuing to say, we're asking Israel tough questions. Well, was the U.S. asked all these tough questions 2 weeks after 9/11? Did the entire world incessantly browbeat the U.S. about Afghan civilians after 9/11? And by the way, those Afghan civilians, they were the sole responsibility of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, just as civilians are in Gaza. And folks, my heart breaks for any civilians caught in the crossfire here. But I'm not going to point the finger at Israel. This is Hamas, which is intentionally placing these civilians in the line of fire. So let's point the finger of, yes, civilian casualties, horrible, heartbreaking, tragic. But let's point the finger of blame for that at the source and the cause of it. That's Hamas. Hamas attacked Israel. Hamas invaded, yes, invaded with up to 2,500 jihadists, southern Israel, and butchered over 1,000 people and wounded thousands more and destroyed communities. So, yes, any blowback for that should be laid at the feet of Hamas. Listen, folks, I'm not naive. I know that Israel relies on the U.S. for a good chunk of its weaponry and military assistance. So, yes, the U.S. does have leverage. And Defense Minister Yoav Gallant essentially said as much yesterday. He said, look, we have to consider the U.S.'s requests and the U.S.'s opinions and views on this. We have to consider it. They give us so much assistance. We have to at least listen. And he was talking about the humanitarian aid, the humanitarian corridor in Gaza that the U.S. has been demanding. And now the U.S. today, Blinken said, well, maybe we can have humanitarian pauses in the war, where Israel pauses its war effort and humanitarian aid is sent into Gaza. Who ever heard of such a thing in warfare ever? Any other nation being asked to do that? Would the U.S. do that? Would Russia? Would China? A humanitarian pause? Would Vlad give that to Ukraine? Would China give that to Taiwan? I think not. Would North Korea give that to South Korea? Would Iran give that to its enemies? Israel is a sovereign nation being lectured to by the world, but it's stunning. It is absolute obsession, an absolute obsession by the world with Israel. It's actually stunning. Why? Why the obsession with this tiny nation the size of the state of New Jersey? And someone asked me that the other day, and folks, it's clearly a spiritual battle. It's a spiritual issue, and I told this friend of mine quite clearly, it's spiritual. Clearly. The book of Zechariah talks about this. The Bible is very clear. The days are coming when the world will be absolutely obsessed with Israel, and in particular, Jerusalem. Israel is not only the center of the world geographically, it's at the center of God's prophetic plan. And the devil, he exists. The devil hates what God loves. He said, this is my land. God holds the title deed to that land. He says that Israel is the apple of his eye. And he also says that Israel, the people of Israel, have returned never to be uprooted again. So that gives you an idea of where the obsession comes from. And if you doubt the obsession, have you observed what's been going on here in the West in the past few weeks? Massive rallies and protests, 100,000 taking to the streets in London. Look at New York City. Look at Germany. Look at Paris. Look at Australia, Chicago, my hometown of Philadelphia. Massive pro-Hamas protests. An absolute obsession with the world's one and only Jewish state. It's the size of New Jersey. 9 million people live there, and only 7 million of them are Jews, yet the world is obsessed with it. Doesn't anyone else? And I don't know, we have, look, I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a Christian. We have many people here watching, and everyone's welcome, who are not Christians. What do you think? Why is everyone clearly obsessed with Israel? The entire world is obsessed with Israel. I laid out why I believe that. It's God's land. It's a spiritual battle. It's prophetic. The Bible was clear that this is how it's going to be in the last days. Israel's rebirth in 1948. Folks, who ever heard of such a thing? You think God has nothing to do with this? Listen, I can give you secular arguments for Israel all day long, and I do. And when I'm on Fox News or other secular networks, coming at it from purely, I give secular analysis and commentary. I don't mention God like I would on TBN, like I would on this channel. If I get an opportunity to, I will. But it's a different kind of venue, and I get that. But folks, when you're talking about Israel ultimately, and we can talk about secular reasoning all day, you can't separate this from God. This is one thing, you can't take God out of it. I was talking to someone one time and debating this, and he said, take God out of it for a second. When it comes to Israel, you can't. Let's be very clear. But who ever heard of such a thing for a people to be mostly dispersed for 2,000 years nearly to the ends of the earth, and then to come back 2,000 years later against all odds out of the ashes of the Holocaust, to come back and reestablish a thriving and successful nation, to revive the Hebrew language after over 2,000 years? Who ever heard of such a thing in human history? You haven't, because it's never happened before. Israel is not like other nations, and that's why the world is obsessed with it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Everyone, what do you think? We've got a pretty active chat going here. So it is very, very good to see. It's funny. Someone commented earlier about dancing Israelis on 9/11, a lie that's been bandied about over the years. But what is a fact about 9/11 are the video footage, and just go to the tape. You can find it anywhere on the web, of Palestinians dancing in the streets after 9/11 and handing out candy and celebrating. Very interesting. So let's have our facts straight when it comes to that. But folks, dangerous times, dark times. We didn't even get into Hezbollah, how things are intensifying there, and dangerous times generally, obviously, but dangerous for Israel to have one hand tied behind its back, essentially, when it's trying to fight this war. Now, Tel Aviv, you see the title here. Tel Aviv was bombarded today with hundreds of rockets. We told you this earlier. But the last point to make here before we go, as we talk about the U.S., folks, listen, weak men create hard times. Rule of thumb. And we've got many showing weak leadership, if you can call it that, in the West right now. No doubt. Winston Churchill is turning in his grave. Let's just say that. Weak men create hard times. And when the Iranian regime is not held accountable, it's going to continue to push and push and push. And that's why you see an uptick in attacks over the past several days against U.S. forces in the region, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iraq, whether it's the Houthi rebels, Iran-backed in Yemen, launching drones and rockets at Israel, but the U.S. got involved in that engagement and thankfully shot those down. That's a good thing. But for U.S. bases to be attacked and for there not to be a U.S. response and for there not to be, just for the U.S. to be absolute red line, non-starter, zero tolerance for any Iranian-backed attacks on U.S. assets in the region is a big problem. But that's what we've seen. That's been the MO over the past 2.5 years. U.S. bases have been attacked in Syria and Iraq over 80 times, and the U.S. has only responded some 4 times. So, of course, Iran's going to continue to push and push and push. And now we have statements by U.S. leaders and U.S. officials saying, hey, we're very concerned that our assets in the region will now be targeted. I am too, as an American. But if you're not going to respond to the Iranian regime and establish real serious deterrence, those attacks sadly will continue. So it's a tinderbox right now, folks, and unpredictable what's going to happen next, no doubt. Anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen next is not being truthful with you, and I'm being kind putting it like that. But hey, we're in the times. These are prophetic times, no doubt. The prophetic chess pieces are moving on the board, and hey, we'll continue to pray, and we will continue to be optimistic, because we're not to have a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So we'll continue to be optimistic as the world's crashing down. We know God Almighty still sits on the throne. So take heart. These things have to happen. But as I said yesterday, faith, family, freedom. Hold on to those 3 things. Hold on to the Lord. Hold on to your family and live as free as you can in these upside down times we're living in right now, where good is called evil and evil is called good. Thanks so much for joining us here today on the live stream. We're going a bit earlier tomorrow, I believe 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Don't quote me on that. Not sure yet. I will confirm that. We'll send out the alert, and I will confirm that by tomorrow morning here on our channel. We'll post it in the community tab and on social media. But tomorrow we will be joined from Jerusalem on the ground report by my good friend Joel Rosenberg. So that is tomorrow. You won't want to miss it. He's got a lot to say. He just returned from the Lebanon border. Check it out tomorrow. I'll have the time with you, the time for you by tomorrow morning. Until then, thanks so much for joining us. God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an upload, and tap the bell icon so you're notified every time a new video is posted. And don't forget to share your thoughts, insights, and comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow.